Welcome. I'm Kristen McCarthy-Vahey. I have the privilege of co-chairing our working group for the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future, our state and municipal statutory plan working group. And today, first of all, thanks for being here. Apologies that for the late communication on the specifics of the agenda. As we had said for in previous meetings, we're going to take a look at what some other states are doing. But first, we'll just start with introductions today. So if we can go around, we'll go John and then Eric. Eric, I will let you introduce the person who's with you, and then we'll go from there. So John, you're up first.
Thank you, Representative. Good to see you. My name is John Board. I am grew up in Reading, live in New Britain currently, and I've worked with multiple municipalities ranging from Reading, Danbury, Newtown, and most recently, the city of Derby.
Thanks, John. Eric?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Lindquist with the Office of Policy and Management. I work in the Intergovernmental Policy and Planning Division in what is known as the Office of Responsible Growth, where we focus on land use policy and planning and the Plan of Conservation and Development. And with me is my intern for the summer, Amelia Maynard from the University of Connecticut. And she's going to be giving a presentation today on some of her research. The next item on the agenda, we'll talk about that next.
Great. Amelia, if you want to say hi, to be followed by Kevin.
Yeah, sounds good. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm interning with OPM this summer, and I'm excited to share what I've been doing so far this summer.
Great. Kevin, and then Robert.
Hi, everyone. Great to be with you, and welcome, Amelia, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing and the research that you put into this. I'm Kevin Alvarez. I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff for Mayor Elliker in the city of New Haven.
Great, thank you. Robert, and then Mr. Beckett.
Thank you. Okay, I'm Robert Hendrick. I'm Chair of Planning and Zoning Commission for the town of Ridgefield. I've only lived in Connecticut for 5 years. I grew up in Philadelphia as Representative McCarthy-Vahey, and I still need to have Philadelphia chat. And I apologize in advance if I either look tired or if my background looks like a hotel. It's because I've flown to Europe. I'm sitting in Luxembourg, and it's definitely closer to bedtime for me than the rest of you.
Wow, and that's a long way from Philadelphia. So we're grateful that you're here with us today. Thank you for making the time.
I'm particularly interested in the comparative nature of what we're talking about tonight because for my business, I do real estate development in a variety of countries, including where I am today.
Wow, neat. That's well, and I do look forward to that Philadelphia conversation for certain. So Mr. Beckett and then Ms. Goulet.
Hi, Chip Beckett. I'm from Glastonbury, former chairman, Glastonbury Town Council, and former chairman of CROG.
Thank you so much.
Maureen Goulet. I am Principal Program Manager at the Capital Region Council of Governments. I'm managing programs for brownfields assessment remediation and also working on the plan, the regional plan for natural hazard mitigation. And I'm very happy to be here.
We are happy that you're here. Ashley, I don't know if you're willing to say a quick hello as the woman behind all of this so much, and then Mr. Gardner.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley. I'm policy counsel for the majority leader. As Representative McCarthy said, I am the person that's emailing you constantly. So thank you for bearing with me.
So Attorney Foreman is one of the many people who help, keep us on track and keep us doing or do the behind the scenes work. So Mr. Gardner, last but not least, if you're able to say hello and do a brief introduction. I know sometimes that is impossible on Zoom world as we all do that. So thanks again, everyone. I know it's summertime and people are, well, literally all over the world in this case. We'll have at least an initial conversation today I know originally this was, our 1 month, and then you can see on the agenda, we kind of put future topics. You also know that Erin hasn't been able to make it, and she and I have not been able to really touch base. So once we have today's meeting and have the conversations and the items number 2 and 3, as we talk about future topics, we'll talk a little bit more about that and kind of how we go forward. I know we had a little bit of conversation about that at the last meeting too, so wanted to spend a little bit of time touching on that. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric first, and again, have you and Amelia talk a little bit about what you've been doing, speaking of behind the scenes, and then we can move to where we go from there, what else we as a group would like to hear and know as we continue to move forward with this part of the investigation so that we can improve our Connecticut process. Eric.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in today. Again, I'm Eric Lindquist with the Office of Policy and Management. And just as the CCDF process was starting up, it became time to do our normal recruitment that we do for internships here at OPM. We love to take on they're unfortunately unpaid internships, but they're student internships to give high caliber students valuable experience working in state government. And Amelia's name came across my desk, and I immediately thought that she might be a good candidate for doing some research related to this particular CCDF working group on the state planning process, and trying to think ahead to what types of issues would be important to look at, what types of information and data this group would likely want to know. And so trying to plan in advance was a little difficult, but I thought that it was important. For several years, we've had folks, either legislators asking during public hearings in the past, or folks on the outside asking, how does how does Connecticut's process differ from how other states do planning, especially with regard to land use planning and policy? And it's a great question, and it's an area that we lack knowledge in, and it's definitely we have to have sort of that comparison, the ability to compare to what our neighbors are doing in order to inform what makes sense for our own selves here in Connecticut, or recognizing that we are unique and we are independent from those other states, but seeing what they're doing and how they do it is very informative and helpful to us in this process, I believe. So we brought on Amelia earlier this summer, and me and my other colleague, Matt Pafford, who's no longer with us, he took another job, but we were guiding her in her research to look at these other states and dive into them and how they do things. And eventually, I think we're just getting to the point where Amelia is reaching out by phone now and contacting folks at American Planning Association, different state chapters, and getting into the various agency staff that have the knowledge you can't always get from reading a computer screen or looking at a website. So with that, I invited, luckily with Representative McCarthy-Vahey's blessing today, I invited Amelia to come and give a short presentation on her research to date. And hopefully you find it helpful and informative, and maybe we can have a discussion about how to, how she can continue to steer her research for the remaining time she has with us. So with that, Amelia, I'll hand it over to you, and you can talk about what you've been working on.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to share my screen just so people could read along with me. So I'll do that. Let's see. Okay. So where I'm at right now with this project is I've got an initial data collection. I got to go through each state, and it was very informative for me too to see how different states operate with their planning processes. And I'm just starting now, like Eric said, to reach out to people and hear back from them. So I'm excited to start adding it to this PowerPoint And then hopefully by the end, I have a PDF, almost like a PDF document that I can share with people, and that it's informative with different links to access different things. So if anyone needed it in the future, they could dig it up. But so far, Eric and I came up with a list of questions that we kind of want to like steer around the research with. Like, what am I looking for when I look at this legislation and their planning processes? What do I want to focus in on? So we came up with a list of questions to really hone in on. And we want to know like who is responsible for the planning process, and then who must follow or implement the plan in what way. So is it for like agency sponsored activities, those that receive grant money, or like any town development? And then is the plan reviewed or updated when? What is included in each plan? And then if there's any incentives or requirements for a state regarding like the planning practices and policies. And then how does the state measure progress, which is something that would be really interesting to find out. And that's something I almost need to ask people about, because it's very hard to figure out how different municipalities measure that. And then how is the planning body or practice staffed and funded? What is their operating budget? Are some of the questions that I'm looking into. I'm also interested in hearing feedback from you guys, whether you're interested in more of something like how is it reviewed, or if you're more interested in like how is it measured, stuff like that. That feedback is really important for me steering my research going forward. So next I want to go through the overview of each state. I'm doing the New England states because that was what I was interested in. That's just what we came up with early on. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of each of what I've gotten so far initially, and then hopefully I can add more into this document and share it with you guys. So for Maine, the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry is responsible for overseeing the planning process. Legislation established by the state sets up the list of goals for land use planning, and then the municipalities may develop a growth management program. And then the plans can be submitted for review to determine the consistency with the guidelines that the state created. Something I'm looking more into for Maine and a lot of other states is a lot of the municipalities have, it says may do planning processes. So I'm interested in seeing what are the incentives for different towns to do the kind of planning and conservation and development. For Vermont, it's similar. So they provide the means and methods for municipalities and regions to prepare for the prevention, minimization, and future elimination of land development problems. And same thing here, municipalities may undertake a comprehensive planning program, and state agencies that have programs or take actions affecting land use must participate. So that's something different in Vermont for state agencies. And then the agency's plans need to be compatible with any regional or municipal plans, which I thought was interesting. So they have, the state makes like the goals and guidelines, the municipalities can make plans, and then the agencies need to make sure again that it's compatible. And then Regional Planning Commission reviews the planning process of its member municipalities at least twice in an 8-year period, and agency plans must be readopted biannually. And then for New Hampshire, they have 2 different plans. So they have a comprehensive state development plan that's reviewed every 4 years. And then they don't separate it by municipalities. Instead, they have 9 regions, and they each create a master plan that's updated every 5 years. So the state determines the mandatory content for the state development plan, and then the regional master plans need to be consistent with the state plan, and it's reviewed by the Office of Planning and Development. And then just another quick overview for Massachusetts. Towns with a planning board need to make a master plan pertaining to long-term development of the municipality. And what's different here is there's not one state guidelines. Each municipality is responsible for determining and overseeing the planning process. Here, there's no specified timeline for a municipality to update its plans, which is interesting, I thought. I actually got that info from the APA when I contacted them. And then towns with over 10,000 residents, they're required to have a planning board. if there's less than 10,000 residents, they're not required to. And in that case, they don't necessarily have to make a master plan. And I'm researching a little more into that as well. Okay, and then last but not least, we have Rhode Island that I've been researching into. And so Rhode Island they're based on the state guide plan is what they call it. Municipalities then use the plan as a base to create community comprehensive plans. And then again, those basis is the basis for land use regulation and planning. And then the community plans are reviewed by the state, and then when approved, they become binding on state agencies. So they also have to follow these plans and guidelines. And then I have a works cited here. My intention for the works cited is I want to put these links under the information that I have for each overview of the town and be a little more specific. So when you're reading this information, if you wanted to look at it specifically, like the wording on the legislation, I really want to have it like right next to there so you can tap into the link and just have useful like little research points to look at. And yeah, and then I just wanted to open up for any questions or comments that you have. I know I went over a lot of different things all at once and I can talk fast sometimes. So if anyone wants me to slow down and talk about one thing, just let me know.
Amelia, thank you for that and for the research that you have done. I would say that the questions and comments discussion, it probably almost blends a little bit too with number 3. So I would just invite folks as they're questioning and commenting to think about any additional information or more specifics that we would like to learn as we're talking through the presentation and what we see before us. So Mr. Board, followed by Chip.
Thank you, Representative Amelia. Great presentation. I know I did a similar project back when I was in Newtown with Pat Loja. So great job there. Pleased that you're going to be including the hyperlinks directly to legislation. And thanks for the commitment to send it around to the group when you're done. Just a few points that I wanted to make. One, have you, in your research, have you found any sort of universal metrics across the board that states have used, or even local municipalities in different states have used? That's the first question I have for you.
Yeah, just if you could clarify, what do you mean by like metrics? Like an example.
So are there any commonalities in any of the research? Let's take, I don't know, New Britain, Connecticut, and Lowell, Massachusetts. Are there any similarities in let's say those plans or the metrics that those municipalities or on a statewide level use to try to set up, like best practices, let's say?
Yeah, so I've definitely seen a lot of different themes with, especially the ones where the state sets up like the guidelines. They have a lot of they hit a lot of similar points with like housing, conservation, and then it's similar how they have the municipalities, they have to focus in on more specifics to their area. So that's something I would like to add to this presentation, like hit the commonalities with like the guidelines, the initial state plan, and then the different municipalities and how they do it. And yeah, thank you for, I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation and found it helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The second thing that I have, and I'm not sure if it would be appropriate, Madam Chair, but is it possible for us to maybe expand the research field here, just given that we know New England has a very, has a certain historical way of doing planning and doing analysis, as opposed to, let's say, other states like California, which may be more regulated, versus Iowa, Hawaii, etc. Hawaii would be, in my mind, very interesting, the balance between environment, their environmental responsibility and their housing out there. So I would just encourage you, maybe in consultation with Eric, to try to figure out maybe a broad range of states, not only politically, but even governmental structure as well, I think is very important, given that Connecticut's a home rule state. We like we like our local control. Let's maybe look at other states as well that have some, diversity of governmental structure there. Those are the only two major points that I have right now. I have a suggestion for later on, but I'll reserve that for a later time. Once again, great job, Amelia, and back to you, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you. So, Mr. Board, I think you're suggesting maybe picking a few other states outside of New England to make some comparisons. And you also talked about just looking at what those metrics were, and maybe just really more specifically delineating some of those metrics, or as you said, Amelia, kind of those common themes or areas that are being covered. I would imagine, based on your comment, that you're thinking, or we're looking more at the growth management principles. Is that essentially like those types of areas when you're looking at that comparison?
Yeah, you're correct on that.
Okay.
Can I also recommend maybe looking at the NGA, the National Governors Association, and maybe seeing if there is any land use contact there that might be a helpful point person to go to. Once again, that's the National Governors Association. Okay,
thank you. We're going to go to Chip and then to Robert.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was going to suggest we expand states. I would suggest Washington, Oregon, Minnesota, and Colorado are higher growth states, but they're also tend to be Democratic, so it's probably more compatible with what our legislature is interested in. And I would be curious to know on those states how much state agencies had to follow the plan of conservation and development, because my understanding so far from Connecticut is agencies can do whatever they want, regardless of what our plan of conservation and development says. And that doesn't really make any sense. So I think we ought to be clear about how proscriptive it is in other states going forward. I'd like to have that background.
Thanks for that, Chip. That's an interesting question. You're suggesting kind of looking at states that have a similar political demographic in the legislature, and also states that you are saying are higher growth states. Is that right?
I am. I mean, I don't think anybody in the legislature is going to be interested in Mississippi or Alabama, but I'm trying to think of states that are sort of industrial and seem to be growing economically as well.
I mean, frankly, I think it's interesting to look at other states with different political backgrounds too, like Texas and Tennessee, for example, come to mind. I know, for example, having talked with some folks who are land use people and have traveled the country, Tennessee, for example, Nashville comes to mind. And I see Robert is nodding his head with the kind of tremendous growth that they've had and the plus sides, but the challenges that have come with it. So just throwing that out there, also knowing that Amelia as an intern is only going to be able to do so much. We're going to talk a little bit too about how we work together, and also asking OLR, our Office of Legislative Research, to help work together with Amelia to help us with that. But I think, Chip, I appreciate you raising that. The point about some of those growth states is, I think, important. So.
And I'm happy to do other states. It's just I didn't think that it would fall on deaf ears with a larger audience. So that's why I thought if we pick states that are more like us, demographically, it would probably be easier to say there's a best practice there that we might not see in some other states.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to acknowledge, Amelia, the first of all, scope of work in terms of looking at New England, just the reality of our forms of government and the way we do government, which is not by county, which, clearly so many other places in the country that has such a tremendous impact. So thank you for those comments. Robert and then Kevin.
My comments can be a little shorter because actually the conversation between Chip and Representative McCarthy-Vey, it was basically where I was going to come in. I do agree that we should expand states. I would focus not on political ideology, even though I'm a Democrat, Chip, for the record, but I would focus more on the profile of the state in terms of balance between urbanism and rural, agricultural, industrial, and whatnot. And so for that, actually, I do think New Jersey, Maryland come to mind. Frankly, Pennsylvania, my home state, and I do actually think Tennessee. I'm actually doing some work in Tennessee right now, and I think that it actually is struggling with some of the same issues, a lot of the same issues that we have. So, and I like John's suggestion of Hawaii just for fun, just for something different. But the second thing that I would mention, which hasn't been talked about quite as much, is and it was in our last meeting as a group. I think we focused a bit on what teeth exist for the state POCD. How is the state POCD cascaded down, to either agencies or to municipalities or to counties where that's relevant. But really, how is the state POCD related or enforced? And what are the teeth behind it? I think is a major question for us. And especially I assume, by the way, that one of our objectives is to make some recommendations to the legislature, not only in terms of process, but potentially in terms of teeth, enforcement, mandatory referrals, et cetera. And I think we actually need to do that research of figuring out what other states do to put teeth behind their statewide comprehensive plan.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think just back to the specific state conversation, Hawaii may be, for fun, it's a beautiful, amazing place. But one of the things that I think Connecticut and Hawaii share are we have, as many states do, limited land mass and the desire to preserve and protect the environment. We have coastlines. We don't have as much as Hawaii, but certainly those are similarities. But also the housing shortage and what that means for folks and cost of living. I just having the military background and many friends and family who have lived there as a result of that service. So I think in many ways, Hawaii could be an interesting comparison. So, but I recognize our list is growing, so we will have to be judicious in how we get there. We'll come back to that. Kevin.
Thank you very much. And Amelia, I know that even though it's a short presentation, it comprises like a lot of work that gets boiled down to the sort of highest level. So I really appreciate all that went into that. I had a couple of thoughts. I agreed with what everybody else was talking about before in trying to look at other places for comparisons and maybe to narrow the scope of work for you. I don't know if this is a good suggestion, but just trying to initially find what are generally considered some of those really successful examples of land use. I think Nashville is a place that the city of New Haven looks at often, particularly as of late in some of the things that they do. So I think there's probably some really good examples of places that are notoriously doing smart, innovative things around land use. The only thing that I would add to that is maybe expanding that scope, not just within the United States, but beyond, because there might be some really good examples across the world of cities or countries that are really thoughtful in the way that they approach it and might think about it really fundamentally differently than how we approach it here. So I just wanted to suggest that without totally overwhelming your scope of work. One of my questions for you was, I was curious, you had mentioned with Rhode Island that they essentially and correct me if I misunderstood this, once the local plans are approved, and I would assume there's an approval process at the state agencies are then bound to those local plans. And so is that, I'm curious, one, do you know what that approval process is at the state? Does the state have rigid requirements that the local level have to hit certain metrics or certain requirements of what it proposes? And then what powers does the state have to reject that? And then the second part of that is, how does the state have a plan that municipalities are at all bound to in the same way that the state is bound to those local plans? Sorry, that was really long-winded.
Yeah, no. So actually, Rhode Island is one of the ones that I wanted to look a little more into because that was actually the last one I did. Um, but yeah, so they, in a way, like the state makes a lot of like goals and guidelines similar to Connecticut. And then the municipalities from there have to use those guidelines to make their plans, and they're approved within the municipality. And then the state looks at it for consistency. And there is a, I would, I'm going to include the link in my research, but they have like a very long page of exactly like the step by step on how they do that. So I definitely can research more into that and include it. And then state agencies are bound to the municipal plans once they're approved by the state. And again, they have to follow those guidelines. I'm not quite sure exactly how the binding process works for the state agencies. So that's something else I need to look more into for you.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful.
Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Kevin, thank you for that. One, the observation that the amount of work that goes in underneath all that presentation is very, very true. And I would echo that and agree. And thank you, Amelia. I also had the same question about Rhode Island. I said, wow, that's really interesting. But it's, again, there's a process piece, right? Where there's definitely, clearly there's communication that's happening very much. And where in our state process, the state plan is agency directed, municipal plans are municipal directed, the COG plans are COG directed, and they don't necessarily all talk to each other. I'm making a lot of hand gestures here, but for those who are reading the captions, that's, I think, the issue. So, and I see some head nods. Eric.
Sorry, I had to find the unmute button. I just wanted to follow up. These are all really good suggestions, and I think it's important to really take a deep dive into this issue and see how other places do things, how they either do things better or maybe do things worse than we do. I just want to circle back to Amelia's research to date, and I wish that we had her for infinite number of weeks. But she does go back to school in the fall full time, so we only have her for a limited period. And I was hoping to try to figure out the best way to guide her while we have her for the next month or month and a half or so. And as I'm listening to folks in their comments and feedback, I'm wondering if it makes sense to have Amelia sort of do a high level overview of, several more states of our choosing, and come back to us with the information that she has similar to how she's done it for the New England states, for us to then decide, okay, which of these states is worth diving into more deeply. And then the burden then returns to us to figure out how to go about doing that. I don't know if she is going to have the time over the next month and a half or so to really dive deep into all these different states and territories. I would love to be able to have her do it, but I just don't see that as being realistic. So just trying to come up with a plan here for us, if we really want to go down this path and get some really good data and really good information to generate some recommendations off of. I think Amelia is going to create a great starting point for us, but then it's going to be on us to figure out how to take that starting point and take it to the next step. And so like for her, for instance, she was going to go down the path of starting to have actual phone conversations with the planners, the regulators in the various states that she's already been looking into in New England. But we could stop there for New England and maybe do more of a high level approach in other areas instead. So just a couple options for consideration. We did start her off with New England because of the similarity to how Connecticut is structured with the lack of county government. Once you insert the county government equation into things, it's much more difficult to derive those apple-to-apple comparisons. So we thought it was best to start her off in New England at least and expand out from there. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of, I think we always naturally want to shoot for the moon when we see an opportunity to help direct a research project. But I just wanted to get, bring things back into scope with the duration we have Amelia for, and then what is likely to be a pretty extensive research project, if we choose to make it that.
So you're trying to ground us in reality, Eric. Yes. And I think one of the things we want to do too is understand how we can complement with asking OLR and possibly even our LCO attorneys to help. I'm going to go to Maureen, then Chip, then Robert, then John.
Thank you. Eric, you mentioned who does things better and who does things worse. And I'm not sure that we know what that means for Connecticut. Like, what means better, what means worse? Do we have outcomes in mind that we're aiming for that we need to talk about? I think that's something that think different things work in different places. I think that's kind of a nebulous area right now, what's better and what's worse.
I think just to respond to that quickly, it's a great point. And I think what I was referring to is really the there's only so much you can glean from reading a piece of legislation and talking to a regulator in a state agency. There, you're going to get these textbook answers. We really have to dive into folks that can share anecdotal information about how a state's planning process works. I think that's going to be a key thing for us. I love hearing Chip speak because he really he doesn't hold back. He says it how it is, right? And we like to hear that sometimes because that is what we need to get to the bottom of, is how is it really? How separating how it's supposed to work, because we have a process in Connecticut that's supposed to work, right? And you can read the legislation and read how it's supposed to work and think that, gee, it must work great. But how do we drill down? That's my question. How do we drill down to get the real answer of how does it really, this is how it's supposed to work, but how is it really working? And that's what I meant by that.
And Eric, thanks for that. Maureen, you had the floor. Do you want to? No, okay. I would just add before I go to Chip, we have not really asked people to do much in the way of homework in between our meetings. And I know some of the other groups have actually, been meeting at a little bit of a different op tempo. And there are a few different reasons for that. I think, when I look back on the last working group that Eric and I had the pleasure of working on together, which was the GIS working group, we had a lot of in between meeting homework, and we actually divided up the states and looked at them, and folks obviously had different capacity and different connections too professionally, and that's really going to differ for some of us. But that's also something that we might want to talk about in terms of partnering, just recognizing we don't have an extensive staff team behind this effort, and that's also, I think, part of what has impacted our process for the plan as well, right? And the fact that we're a legislative committee, not this committee, but the committee that helps approve the plan and oversees the plan. I say in quotes. So Chip and then Robert.
Well, I just want to respond to Eric. I think the high-level overview of the states would make a lot of sense. What I'd like to see us dive into is the implementation, like Rhode Island, about how do you get continuity from the municipal level to the state level so that it happens and people don't work at cross purposes. And I wouldn't be afraid of counties, because our COGS really are supposed to replace counties. And I know they don't have any money, and I worked pretty hard at CROG to have the state finally recognize our COGs as counties. I don't know that that legislation ever passed, but I know it has been talked about at OPM, and so I hope that it finally would come to pass, that at least federal county money would be available to our COGs to do things, which is part of making the COGs actually be able to do what I think they were designed to do. Stop there.
No, thank you. Though legislation, it was not a legislative action. The federal government did finally recognize our COGS as a county equivalent. And it, I think, remains to be seen what that actually means for us, but it's definitely not a negative and certainly a positive, and hopefully it will do exactly what you said, Chip. We do know that at this point, there is also a heck of a lot of infrastructure funding that's available that the state will not be able to apply for. Our COGs are currently doing a lot of work to try and leverage those opportunities, because our municipalities wouldn't even begin to be able to compete. You know, we're talking about competing with places in other states where, you know, it's a much broader population base, in some cases broader than the entire population of our state. So yeah, you're absolutely spot on about leveraging that. So I'm go to Robert and then John.
Thanks. Well, actually, one of the things that I was going to mention was counties. I think not only do we have the COGS point, which has already been made, but many other states, and I've worked across many states, as I mentioned, many other states, in my experience, the counties don't have any role in planning, or very, very minimal. In other states where I've worked, it's delegated to the local municipalities. Sometimes you get multiple municipalities coming together in a voluntary way. But on that front, since I'm saying, you know, I've worked across these other states, I guess that my second point was I was going to volunteer to represent McCarthy Bay's point. If we want to create a sub working group or something and take some homework offline, I'd be happy to help on a deep dive with this between now and the next meeting, because I think I probably have some of the information or knowledge already in my head. It's probably just a matter of structuring it and working with Amelia to share it. And yeah, I think our list of states, I was trying, as everybody was talking, I was trying to keep track of them. And I think, my total, so we've already looked at, Amelia's already done 5, I guess. And I think if I got it correct, I think people recommended kind of 8 different states. I would definitely look at those 8 and say, let's see if we can get together on 4 or 5 of those, as the next set to focus on.
Yes, it's very funny, Robert, as you're talking, I hear that feeling more and more. I love it. It makes me feel at home. I had 9, the list that I
had.
I
forgot Hawaii. I'm sorry.
Yes, you got it. That's
So
exactly. So I do think, one, first of all, you probably don't have to offer twice. I think you're going to be taken up on in terms of that willingness to do some deep dive. And then, which is great, thank you. And then the second piece, I do think, once we finish kind of this part of the discussion and officially move into our next agenda item, we're gonna do that. We're gonna take that list and talk a little bit more about it. I just want to keep it open for a few more minutes. John.
Thank you. Maybe this falls under the implementation discussion that we were having, but I'd be interested to look at the interaction between these land use and planning committees, either on the state and local level, and the elected board approval committee, and see if there's how do I put it correctly? Any shenanigans going on there in terms of different interests coming into play, or if it's strictly based on facts and data, and sort of seeing if there's any outside influences affecting these elected boards or the final approval boards versus the recommendation of the experts on these land use and planning boards.
That is a very interesting question, and one that I think is going to be really difficult to get to, because I think there are different roles right, when it comes to implementation. And I guess I would similarly, the one question that I had from your very first list, Amelia, to add to when we're looking at the states is, how is the plan approved and ratified if there is one? And who is that ratifying body? I bring that up, John, in concert with what you're saying. I think it's related, kind of a cousin to what you're saying. But it gets to the point of, back to the original scope of this work, which is the process for this. And, how is it created? Who decides what's included? How are those things included? How are they implemented? How are they enforced? How are they coordinated? All of those questions. It's a lot of different pieces, but I think, yeah, that's a good question. Any other kind of general comments about Amelia's presentation before we more
Is it,
John?
Madam Chair, is it possible for us to get a draft of what you have so far, Amelia, just so then if we do have homework, we have a template to go off of?
Yeah, I definitely can send you the PowerPoint, and then I've also been working off just a Word document. I've been putting like all my notes in there, so it's even more in depth. So I can send it over to Eric and let him distribute it, if that's okay with Eric.
Brilliant, thank you.
Sounds great.
I see
Thank you,
Eric nodding his head, and then also, I think Eric also had sent to me, and that's something I wanted to talk a little bit about too, was a document from New Jersey that may be, Amelia, one that you had found as well as a 2003 OLR report. And Eric, I don't know if you want to say just a word about those as well, because we can distribute those out in addition.
Yeah. When I was getting Amelia started with her research, I took some time of my own to just hit Google and search for whatever might be out there that's similar types of research. And I was surprised to come across an old OLR report from I think it was 2003 or so, as the representative mentioned, and they did a pretty thorough job of looking through a number of states. I can't remember if they focused on just New England. I don't have it in front of me, New England or beyond, but they talked about how states' planning offices are set up and how they function, at least in theory, how they're supposed to work, which I thought was a great starting point. And it shows that OLR has done this type of work in the past and could theoretically help again now in current times. And New Jersey had done a very similar thing, not through their equivalent to OLR, but through their state planning office. Back in the even earlier document, I think it was from 1997. But I think in large part it's still relevant today. The states that were cited in the New Jersey report are still those states that have the most robust planning offices in the union. And it's worth noting that I think there are a number of states still that don't have a state planning office, don't have much in the way of planning regulations or planning statutes. Much in the same way that a lot of Connecticut's towns didn't have zoning for a number of years. So in some regards, I'm curious to know how a state without a planning office functions. And that might be something else to look at.
So thanks, Eric. I do have that report, the OLR report. This again was 2003. At least 12 states had planning agencies with land use planning responsibilities. And it's at that time, it said most are located within larger cabinet level agencies having other duties and responsibilities, which would be very similar to the situation here in Connecticut, right? I mean, is that a fair statement, Eric? Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I would say. What's interesting, the history of how our state's planning office has evolved. I'm young on the scene. I wish Dan Morley was here because he's sort of the history book on it. But my understanding is that Connecticut did have its own state planning office. It was its own agency, if you will, or at least a commission board type of entity that was separate from the rest of the executive branch. And it was only in, I think, the 1970s that or 80s that it got folded into OPM. And I wonder, I often wonder how things worked back when we had an independent planning office that didn't have conflicting roles and responsibilities to get in the way or conflict with how balancing the political nature of things when it's apparent. We see it all the time. You have a project that's political in nature and it flies in the face of an adopted policy or plan, and how is that handled? Especially if a governor and his or her administration is in support of said political project. How do you have that balance? And that's something else to look at when looking at other states.
Well, I think we might want to have just again, I think there might be some, individual conversations that need to happen between now and the next meeting in terms of getting, like Robert said, some of those subgroups going. We'll just make sure that folks have both the New Jersey document and the OLR document. And probably Eric and I will put our heads together with Amelia and perhaps Robert, since you volunteered, I'm just going to loop you right into that, to kind of see what our next steps are. And in fact, also, it might make sense for us to pull in OLR to that conversation as well, so that we're all together and kind of seeing where we can go with this. So seeing no other comments at the moment, let's just go specifically and kind of directly in terms of any other additional specific information that we want to learn about what other states are doing. And that really kind of goes to the first slide that you had, Amelia. And that was, the one where I said, I do want to know how that plan is approved and ratified and who the appointing body is. Approving body. And partly why I asked that, as we've had tremendous difficulty getting our plan passed. There are reasons for that. It's, as we've had this conversation, there's process pieces to it, but there's also, I'm thinking again of Robert's comments earlier, how the implementation and enforcement piece of it is and is not seen. And then to Eric's comments now, right? If, I'll just say, I'm certainly not going to name any legislators, but there were folks who said to me, why does this even matter? Right? Why is it important? And I will say, this is part of the difficulty about this conversation even. I often tell people that government is a little bit like an iceberg. What you see at the tip is just the very beginning. And when you think about land use, what you see in the paper about people arguing about things is just the tip of a whole lot else underneath. And the planning process in general is, I think, largely misunderstood, or people just aren't aware of how that works and why it's important. And I think that's true even in the legislature. So that's part of what we face, I think. But are there other additional specific pieces of information that you haven't, as you've heard the discussion today, that we haven't talked about specifically, that you think we should be exploring as we look at these other states? And then we'll talk about which states we're going to go to. Chip?
Yeah, Representative, you raised an interesting thought because, political people and experts design these plans. And then you come up with affordable housing, and you have a lot of people that just want to go home at night and don't want anything to change. We're the land of steady habits, right? So
Yeah.
I moved here 50 years ago. I want nothing to change, no new buildings, no new streets. I'd be happy if my neighbors stayed all the same as when I moved here 50 years ago. That's not realistic, but that's a lot of the pushback that we get on whether it be housing, transportation changes, and some of the bad reputation, I think, is mostly people are just anti-growth because they remember a much smaller, more rural state that they moved to a community, and it's become more urban and metropolitan. And so I think that would be a very interesting policy thing to talk about. How do we sell the plan of conservation development to the public so that they're aware of, you could pick your topic, whether it's bus service, rail service, affordable housing. We're in this as a metropolitan area, if not as a state. Hartford is distinct from New Haven and Bridgeport, but we all have linkages. And I think one of the big problems with our state plan is nobody really acknowledges the linkages except the planning professionals. But we haven't told people why it's important to take a train to Boston or have a new power line or any of the other big infrastructure that we all depend on, or a gas line, because everybody doesn't want a gas line or power line, but heaven forbid if they lose power for 3 hours of a thunderstorm because we didn't fix it.
Well, Chip, you raised some excellent points. It's funny when you first said that, that's what I was thinking too. And I think it's human nature. These conversations that we've had over the past 4 years in my role as the co-chair of planning and development, there have been many very heated, very painful and difficult conversations. And we attribute intent to people. And certainly we know in history, we know there was intent. We have evidence, redlining is not an imaginary thing. It happened. There was intent there. But in terms of today, when we have these conversations, I do encounter many, many people who it's exactly what you're talking about. And there's perhaps sometimes a perception, because here, even in Fairfield, for example, the tremendous explosion in growth happens post-World War II in the 50s, not in the past 10 to 15 years. We have certainly seen growth in Fairfield. The types of housing has changed. We have more multifamily development near our train station, which is what our residents, many of them, are looking for. But you're absolutely right in that, how do we communicate? And in a sense, I'm thinking about some of the marketing professionals, of which I am not, but how do we make those linkages? I think that was a really good word that you used, and help people understand exactly why this is important. I would say that's starting with the legislature. I really think that's a big part of the conversation too, not just the general public, but the legislature as a whole. And then in turn, our local folks. So I think, thank you for raising that, John, and then Maureen and Eric.
Thank you, Representative. Would it be helpful? I'm not sure, because I know we've discussed a lot here. And I know you probably have been taking diligent notes. I've been trying to keep up on my end. Would it be helpful if maybe we kind of review what information we've asked for or inquired about so far, and then that might lead to some other things and avoid us repeating and ending up in a circular situation, just to help us refocus?
Why don't you throw out what you have in your notes, John? Go for it.
I have the states. I know we haven't really decided that. I know there's been talk of the international research looking at certain metrics, looking at states that have high growth, getting OLR on us, how to assist us, and then also the counties as well, county cog equivalencies. That's what I have so far. I know I probably missed a lot more, but those were kind of the main points that I have. Anyone else, please jump in and help. Please and thank you.
No, I think I would add to that my specific requests in terms of the ratification process. I think another one that we had that Robert brought up is the teeth that, or, consequences or incentives that exist.
Enforcement mechanism.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's one that we want to be looking at across the board. I think the Kevin's point was about the looking at successful land use, and I think Maureen made the point, well, what do we know is better or worse? Now, Kevin, you were talking about outcomes of success, right? You've seen Nashville and the kind of growth that's happened there and the vibrancy of the economy, right? It's a destination for so many people, especially for so many bachelor and bachelorette parties, which is actually one of the problems they're facing. But I think, Maureen, you were talking about the planning process itself a little bit more. And maybe you could elaborate on that, but I think that's a question. What does better or worse mean? And what are some of the outcomes we're looking for? I think that's a little bit of the circular, because we're looking at this process and will it lead to better outcomes? But Maureen, did you want to chime in and maybe respond a little bit to what I'm saying, but also you had something else of your own?
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, I would also be interested in participating in a little homework. So if we want to divvy it up further, I'm happy to do that. One of the things you mentioned is, sort of communicating about what is desirable in terms of this kind of plan. And I recently participated in a number of events with the town of Manchester's Plan of Conservation and Development kickoff. And one of the things that came up is that when people visit other places where they can walk places, they can get on a train, they can get on a bus and go to fun things easily, sort of, what do you do on vacation and what do you like about it? And why don't you want to have it here in Connecticut?
There we go. I had muted myself. So Maureen, I think what you're saying is that as part of that process, people were engaged in those conversations related to what they do when they go away, and that so many people were talking about those things that you just shared, which is to be able to walk somewhere or hop on a train or a bus or a bicycle, as in the case of some international communities more.
Yeah.
And that those are things you hear people talking about, liking, but that you don't hear them saying, we would like to have that here in Connecticut.
No, I think the people who were involved in this were very supportive of having it here, but I think there's a lot of resistance always in Connecticut to changing the way we do things. Even if we don't like the way it is now, we don't want to change it.
Sure. Yep. It's hard. The inertia factor can be hard, and the fear of what may happen is certainly true. John and then Robert.
A quick question for you to Amelia. What was the legislative involvement in these other states, at least based on the New England states? And maybe that's a bigger question for the committee to research, is what the legislative involvement is in other states.
So I'm going to jump in for 1 second. I'm going to need to actually put you on the spot, Eric, and I apologize for doing this, but you can hear the barking dog in the background, and I happen to be alone in the house for the first time in probably 2 years. And so I need to address that really quickly, but if you can continue, keep the conversation rolling, I'll be right back.
John, could I just ask you to repeat that?
Yes. Question to Amelia. The legislative involvement in other states that you've researched, and maybe that's a greater question that we have for the other states that we look at, is what the basic question is: what is the legislative involvement in either the planning, approval, or enforcement or enforcement of the various plans, either local or state?
That's a really good question. And Amelia, I think you probably understand what John's asking, and I don't know if your research dove into this area exactly, but it is an area that we definitely should look at. But I think John's referring to power of the executive branch agencies to plan and implement policy versus the state legislatures. Did you find anything on that, Amelia, in your research?
Just a little bit. It really depends on the state. I think a lot of times what comes down to legislator is they're reviewing it, the processes once they're made, and they're making like the approving the initial like guidelines that go down to the municipalities that plan. So they kind of like make the basis for the planning process for the municipalities, I find in a lot of states. But other than that, I would definitely need to dive deeper on the specific powers just to get a clear understanding and not guesswork.
Also, is there any budgetary impact? So either from, I guess, an OPM or what another state's equivalent of OPM or governor's budget office is in terms of using state funds or applying for state grants as well. I think that might be something to look into. So just legislative, the balance between the legislature and the executive, and this may go back to what we were saying earlier about a different, to have a different department, to shift it out of you guys into either a different cabinet department or have a standing department altogether.
Thank you all. Thank you, Eric, for doing that. Everything's being recorded now, so I'll just share that the water main has to be replaced. It's Aquarian visiting, so that's who's here at my house. And I apologize. I'm gonna need to pop back down in just a minute. So this is, I think all of us nowadays are used to this little juggle. And you'll have to fill me in. I'm not gonna ask you to repeat. I'll circle back, Eric, with you and Amelia on that. I do. But I heard the tail end of that conversation, which I think was helpful. Robert, and then also I just want to recognize too, before I turn it to you, Robert, that Lynn has joined us. Welcome, Lynn, and feel free to chime in at any point. We are on item number 3 on the agenda, just discussing additional information that we would like to learn from other states to build on the research that Amelia has done and that some others are going to do. So now to you, Robert.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you clarified that it was Aquarian, because I think everybody was thinking it was Amazon. At least I was. But I was just thinking, in our, if we're going to, the output of a comparative analysis, it's good to have a little bit of a framework. And I was personally, I love what Amelia's already started with, but if we put it into buckets of like who, when, what, how, kind of the classics. I think the big one that's complicated that I want to dive into for a second and get reaction on is the who. The who by itself is actually a really like big mess of, it's the matrix, and it's government, and it's counties in some cases, and municipalities and states, et cetera. So I would suggest if some might be familiar with the framework, if you do a lot of project management or things like that, you might be familiar with RACI, the RACI framework, where for everything you identify who's responsible, who's accountable, or the approver, who's consulted in the process, and then who's informed. And I think actually the informed part's pretty easy on comprehensive planning, but the responsible, accountable, and consulted parties and identifying that by itself could actually be like literally kind of fill in the blank on a matrix. And just looking at that visually, state by state basis could be really helpful to understand, who's got each one of those roles in each state. I think we'll find that there's a lot of difference, but I don't know that until we kind of go through that exercise.
Robert, I think you're setting yourself up for some significant homework, which I'm so grateful for.
I like to know what the homework is before I do it.
Yeah. No, I say that in a very complimentary way, because I do think you're right. That type of a matrix and way of looking at things, one, makes it a lot more clear for all of us who are wanting to help do the deeper dive, Amelia or OLR, Eric, myself, anyone. And two, then in terms of communicating that back to us as a group and then potentially others, could help put that in a format that is a lot more digestible. Because, look, in the end, this group in large part was formed to help provide recommendations which will go to the legislature. And I'm a legislator. I have tremendous respect for my fellow legislators, and you all, I think, many of you have heard me say, we've got to go to the 4th grade level and assume that we have very limited time, because legislators are looking at such a broad range, and we're already starting from a deficit, as we were talking about earlier when Chip was commenting. So in terms of, the sense of urgency for something like this with planning. So I think that's a really helpful framework, and perhaps we could have, just a little bit of a sidebar, who and what, how.
It would be great to be able to say in our summary something like, I'm going to make this up because I don't have the data, but if we looked at 10 states at the end of the day, if that's what we decided was like manageable, and we discovered that 6 or 7 of the states, which we think are relevant comparatives, if we discovered that there was a government agency that that was responsible for developing the plan, and that government agency looked like this, then that gives us a lot of firepower to make our recommendation for, or the legislature, in 7 of the 10, the legislature approves, or maybe the legislature doesn't approve. Maybe it's actually an administrative approval for all we know. I think if we collected the data in that sort of way, then we'd have a lot of support for our recommendations.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Before we get to I think one of the last points of conversation before we jump off today, which is to decide what those states might be, or to decide that we're not going to decide. And I say that in part because there might be some initial research done that says, nope, this may not be the right state for us. So I think we should come up with a target list, but then ideally we would then, kind of give leeway for substituting, because it, for whatever reason, the inability to collect that data, whatever that might be. So just using 2 lists. Hang on one sec, going back and forth between. Oh, hang on one second, everybody. Thanks, everyone. So we have the New England states, and Amelia, there were 5. Did you already do, or am I counting correctly that you already had 5 already? On the list from, I'm just going to read you the list from that OLR report that we were discussing from, that was a while back now, quite a few years, 2003. 12 states, and those states they're states with planning agencies with land use planning responsibilities. At that time, those states were Colorado, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Washington. Now there's some overlap in that list between the list that we had suggested, which are the New England, or had been discussing, which are the New England states, and the ones I heard were Washington, Oregon, Minnesota, Colorado, New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and then Hawaii. Realistically, is looking at another 5, or are we looking at probably more like 4? I mean, again, keeping in mind that OLR is another place we would like to turn. I'm gonna look to you.
Amelia, can you just read out the 5 New Englands that you had, just so then we have a comprehensive list, if you don't mind? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So the ones that I went over were Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island.
So, I mean,
Robert, do you want to go ahead?
I don't want to jump in out of turn, but you know, it's my thought, and this might be provocative, but I personally don't see a lot of value in why we would spend a lot of time on Maine or potentially Vermont. They're not really comparative states other than being geographically in New England. Their population density is much lower. They're not states that are, you know, between major metropolitan centers in the United States, like Connecticut. I just don't see them being very relevant. I would personally suggest that we drop a couple of New England states and add a few that might be more relevant elsewhere.
I will just respond to that momentarily, because while I understand what you're saying, their forms of government are very similar. So one of the things that, and perhaps not in the case of Maine as much as I think about Vermont, in that we do so much town by town, and they do too in Vermont.
Vermont.
So that's I mean, I think you're raising a good point, and we should think about that. I also think, I mean, we don't necessarily need to make the decision today. It would be good if we could get a start on that. But like I said, I think we want to give folks some leeway there as they're exploring. But that's not a bad point to at least drop one. Before I go to you, John, I want to say hello to Lynn and thank you for joining us. I know you juggle many responsibilities. And Rachel has also joined. And just since you're here on camera, Lynn, to ask you, is there anything as you're thinking about this just broadly, or you, Rachel, either one, and maybe just introduce yourself, but we did that at the beginning, quick hellos, which we try to do, about this conversation in terms of how we're looking at other states to be able to look for comparisons, ideas about how to improve here in Connecticut.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm Lynn Haig, Director of Planning for the City of Bridgeport. My brain isn't fully in with you guys, so I hadn't really started to think about how to compare, so I apologize.
Well, don't apologize whatsoever. I just wanted to make sure you've had the opportunity to chime in, and I'm glad you're here, and I think, yeah, we have plenty more. Rachel, do you want to just say a quick hi too?
Sure. Hi, and sorry, I had the wrong time today, so my apologies on that one. Someone just got messed up, but so Rachel DeSenza, and I from New Canaan, Connecticut. I work in the health insurance industry and government programs. So I think your question was how should we, or how can we look to other states to gain additional information on what we might do in Connecticut, if I understood that correctly. I always say, why would we create the wheel if someone else is doing it well in my industry, in my world? So that was kind of my initial thought. I think in our first meeting when I brought up, hey, what are other states doing? Other states are, that may have similar, makeup that we do. And that are doing it well. I think we could probably learn. I always do lessons learned, right? So what are the lessons learned, good and bad, that other states have gone through that we can use? Maybe not an exact replica, but glean information, again, good and bad from them. That's kind of what I was thinking when I initially had brought this up meetings back. You know, one of the things that I am seeing kind of in our area as, you know, going through the process is, you know, where are the pitfalls or where the pitfalls may be. And so states maybe that have been doing some of the things we're maybe looking to implement longer, maybe they've, you know, realized some pitfalls and we can learn from them and fast track some of this and not have to go through some of the pain points. I know some of the things we were talking earlier, you know, to use a stick versus a carrot, you know, would love to learn what's worked, what hasn't, and what worked, you know, what was the upside and downside from doing that. So that was my thoughts on that.
Great. Well, Rachel, you're saying you had a different time was a nice reminder to me. And Ashley reminded me, we had to move our time today because another group is actually meeting at 4. And this is our room to meet in. So they are going to need to come into the room in just a moment. So unfortunately, John, I apologize. I'm going to have to cut you off. And I'm sorry, I lost track of time. I actually thought we'd be shorter today, but this is the thing about this. There's so much for us to talk about. I think what we're going to do, we have the next regularly scheduled meeting. Sometimes we end up needing to do the time shift and we'll check in earlier. We were late. That was, you know, my bad on getting the agenda out, which would have triggered a reminder on the time. So my apologies for that. But we are scheduled, I believe, for the 11th of August at this point. That's my, do I have that correctly, Ashley? I'm just double checking. I believe that's it. I may be wrong. I see a thumbs up. And so what I think what we'll do is we're probably going to end up having a smaller, you know, mini working group. If folks, I see John put in the chat, if others have input specifically other than what we talked about or specific to the states, please send Ashley and I, and include Erin too. She'll be back at some point, Erin Kemple. But in the meantime, I just appreciate you all hanging in with this process and continuing to have this conversation. I know there's still a lot that's kind of floating out there and seems fuzzy, but I think we're making progress. So I appreciate everybody's willingness to help and to dig in. So Lynn and Rachel, you can be grateful for a short meeting today. Oh, can't hear you, Rachel, for some reason. You're not able to hear. I don't know if others can hear Rachel either. Yeah.
Is it still at 4 on the 11th?
At this point, yes, and we will communicate. There's another group that's meeting, I think, every other week is part of the problem, the same time frame. So I want to thank you all again very much for being here, and we'll get word out sooner so that people will know. And I'll talk to Ashley today to see if we anticipate that that's coming up again, that conflict. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Robert, I hope you get some sleep. All right. Bye-bye.